Hi everybody, and welcome back to another Look Back review. Final Fantasy VII is a game that I missed when it came out back in 1997. To be honest, it was only when I was a teenager did I first hear the name Cloud Strife and the words Midgar from some friends as they were discussing PS1 games in school. It sounds really stupid, but when I was younger, I didn't even know Final Fantasy games 1 through 7 existed. I'd only played Final Fantasy 8 at this point. Simpler times, I suppose. Currently, I have a small panic attack every time I go out and do a food shop. And don't you dare tell me that I'm the only one who holds my breath whenever I walk past someone in the aisle. Look, I know it does nothing to protect me, but you try telling my hypochondriac brain that. I finally picked up Final Fantasy VII for the first time around a year ago after getting it in a sale for $7.99 on the PS4 store. I played it for around 10 hours and felt like the game never really grabbed me, so I put it down and let it gather a little bit of dust. After seeing reviews start to roll in for the new Final Fantasy VII Remake, I thought I needed to give it another go. So I sat down, got a large cup of coffee, and jumped into Midgar again, with the sole purpose of playing it through to the end. Original planning for the game started back in 1994, when it was originally going to be just another 2D game for the SNES. Square was also working on Chrono Trigger at the same time they were planning Final Fantasy VII, meaning that when they asked for help from the Final Fantasy team as the project got bigger, that meant some of the ideas that were planned for Final Fantasy VII actually ended up in Chrono Trigger instead. When the team returned to Final Fantasy VII in late 1995, they felt they'd be left in the dust of their competition if they just made another 2D game. This led to the team looking to create a 3D game, and after the developers had a play around and saw what they could create with real-time battles and animations, they were sold that this was the way forward. It's interesting to note that when planning resumed back in 1995, they didn't have it all planned out. In fact, they were still missing a lot of the core ideas after passing some of these over to Chrono Trigger. They instead had the attitude to work things in as the planning progressed, which is amazing to think as most games that are made this way normally result in a game that falls far short of expectations. A big issue with this new, bigger vision would be that Nintendo, who at this point had hosted all previous Final Fantasy games on their system, had a massive storage issue that they couldn't get past. The developers knew the space needed to hold all these pre-rendered backgrounds and cutscenes was massive, and after speaking to Nintendo, it was clear that the new console, the N64, wouldn't be able to meet the team's vision. So it was announced that they would go with PlayStation in January of 1996 instead. When it came out, it was noted to have been the most expensive game ever made at the time. It had up to 120 3D artists to help bring the game into the third dimension, some of which had worked on films like Jurassic Park and Star Wars. This meant that when the game was finished, it ended up costing Square around $45 million back in 1997. I do not want to know what that is now with inflation. So Final Fantasy VII's story is something which starts off simple, gets a bit more complicated, gets drunk and drives off a cliff before washing up on a beach with no memories of the night before, and coming around to give you an awesome ending, but with a hell of a hangover that leaves you asking many questions. To give you some context, we start our journey in one of the largest cities in the world, Midgar. Midgar is run by a large energy company called Shinra. They make energy by draining a substance called Mako from the planet and converting this energy into power that powers your lights, your fridge, your TV, etc. The way Shinra creates this energy is by draining it from the planet directly, and it's the planet's life source that they're using to make energy. To put it simply, it's a lot like fossil fuels, but a lot worse. Rather than the planet suffering from global warming, if Shinra keeps draining the planet will just die. Shinra's reach isn't just in Midgar though, it's put itself at the top of the food chain in this world in a lot of different ways. It runs a lot of the world's politics, the larger businesses, and the military might. But because Shinra is giving itself such a good positive company image, the people of the world all assume that Shinra is doing what they can to get the energy they need responsibly, with the planet's and the people's needs at heart. Shinra has very much got a tight grip over the world due to its various dealings, but this is where the terrorist group Avalanche come in. They plan to destroy Midgar's energy reactors to slow the drain on the planet and send a direct and explosive message to Shinra. We start the game on one of these missions. We jump off the train as a mercenary for hire, Cloud Strife, and make our way to one of the reactors. The game starts off relatively simple. We're working for Greenpeace, but with guns, magic, and a few more explosions. But the journey it takes you on, the massive twists and turns, it makes it a story that's well worth playing through today. Heck, it's one of the best RPG stories I've ever played through. Full stop. My only two criticisms would be that it takes a fair old while to get interesting, and it's not always clear what's going on, or has gone on, or what you have to do, or where you have to go. Once you've played through the game, the slower intro does make sense. It's actually a really interesting part of the game to play through once you have context for it. But at the time, I felt like the motivations were a little thin. I'm not saying that taking down a large corporation and secretly killing the planet isn't interesting, but due to the game trying to set up a lot of moving pieces that I won't spoil here, it just felt very front heavy on game lore and information. It's one of those moments where you tell your friends, look, just play through the first 6 or 7 hours and it gets really good. It's just an absolute cop-out of an answer. But if you're a player that doesn't mind reading through text in a game and you're happy to take your time and take in all the information it gives you, then just play through the first 7 or 8 hours because it really does get better after that. If you're someone who just wants to mash through the text and blast through it as quickly as possible, then you're going to miss out on the best part of the game. You might want to skip it or choose to play it when you've got a bit more time on your hands. Regarding moving forward in the game or progression, for me it's a bit of a design flaw, but I just couldn't find a map with the names of the locations on it. I had this map, but if someone told me, hey, let's go to Midgar, I think it's here, or here, or here. So when finishing a dungeon, one of the characters would often say to me, we need to go to X location. And I was like, great, do you want to drive? Because I have no idea where that is. Moving on to the larger cast of characters, including one that's completely optional, they're all used superbly to not only tell the main story, but branch off to tell their own separate side stories, which then led back into the narrative really well. From a mission to save Yuffie, a story of love and loss with Vincent, to a story of regret with Barrett. Final Fantasy VII proves you can have good individual stories while also weaving individual narratives together to reinforce the characters and that overall story. To put it simply, it's a great way to sneak in some more world building that's much more interesting than the mandatory stuff you had to go through at the start of the game. To explain my point a little more, let's take Barrett for example. He's a character that originally welcomed Shinra into a small town a few years ago. Shinra was to create a new generator there and help turn the traditional coal mining town into a place for the better. This all changes when Barrett comes home one day to find Shinra have burned the town to the ground. We see what used to be a much more light-hearted character turn into a hardened person who is prepared to do anything to get revenge on Shinra. But he also has a much softer side when dealing with Marlene, a little girl who survived the fire from his hometown a few years ago. We also see that he's a character who can be a bit slow to follow what's going on in the story. In some of the catch-up sessions Cloud does with the rest of the cast, Barrett openly says he's getting lost or struggling to keep up with the information. From this, we see that Barrett is much more a man of action, rather than any sort of strategist. It's not a game changer by any means, but it's a lot more than I expected from a game that came out so long ago. In fact, the characters have got a good amount of believable personality, and it's way better than I got in Final Fantasy VIII. There should also be a link to that review in the top corner, so do consider giving it a watch after this one. Moving on to presentation, and this is where the game takes a big old dip. Yes, the game came out in 1997, but this game is ugly. Like most first-gen 3D titles, it hasn't aged terribly well. I'd never played through the game before, but my god did I get a shock when I started playing through it recently. After a while, I did find the models were a bit charming, like my freaky little Playmobil people, if you see what I mean. But anyone who says this game holds up graphically has got some serious nostalgia glasses on. I also had an issue with some of the pre-rendered maps. They just weren't clear and detailed enough to let me know what I could interact with. I had to play with these little indicators on the whole time, as when I didn't, I was just blindly walking towards random doors or walkways, looking to see which ones would work and which ones wouldn't. they just never seemed consistent as to what was walkable and what wasn't. This wasn't an issue in the open world as it had its own low poly charm going on, but in those pre-rendered backdrops, they were just a real issue for me to navigate. Moving on to music, and the first thing to mention is that the PS4 version has its volume set really high for some reason. I'm not sure if this is the same in all the other versions, so please do let me know in the comments if this is the case. But whenever I played with headphones on, I got this massive shock every time the game started up. You would think I would learn, but nope, every single time it scared me. However, I'm glad to say the music was brilliant, setting the mood in all interactions with your fellow party members, cementing important emotional and critical story points, and pumping you up for boss fights. Even with the sound with what sounds like the original PlayStation 1 soundtrack, it stood the test of time for me. Some notes sometimes come out a bit distorted, but that's just every now and again, and I think it's more to do with the volume, so it's not going to ruin your experience at all. A big moment where the music impacted me is where this very innocent but grand music plays in the background while you fight the final boss right at the end of Disc 1. I'm sure anyone who's played through this game already knows what I'm talking about, and even though I knew the twist was coming, I did have a little lump in my throat when I played through this fight. The music just set the mood perfectly, helping me empathise with the characters on screen. Something dreadful had just happened to a very well-liked character, and although we were still in that moment, we had a boss to fight. It's just such a powerful sequence of events that led up and are present through that boss fight. It was brilliant. Moving on to my last point in presentation, which is the menus, and this is something that hasn't aged too well either. I really struggled to get to grips with the magic system. It would always take me a while to move materia around from character to character, and the magic descriptions weren't explained too well either. Like, it would tell me the name of the magic and give me the name of the skill you could use of it, but not what those skills are or what they would actually do. I mean, this is exactly what Google is for, I know, but it would have been nice for something in the game to tell me what the fudge death blow does, or what the heal magic actually heals. The basic gameplay of Final Fantasy VII is pretty simple. It was Square's first 3D entry on a 3D console, so overall, the design was made to be easy for what would be a lot of new players who might not have ever played an RPG before. It's a classic turn-based RPG with the focus being on magic you could equip to each character. Magic could be swapped around at will, and magic would also gain its own type of experience called AP. Any magic equipped in battle can level up and either unlock more or bigger versions of that magic. You could also find summon materia, which would allow a character to summon a powerful monster for a big attack, at the expense of a large amount of MP. You could also get powerful attacks once your limit gauge had filled up. Limit is earned by taking damage, and each character has their own unique limit attack, and these can be upgraded through either using them over and over again, or by giving a character a new weapon or item. I found that with the large amount of magic and the ability to strategize with what you had, it was deep enough to stop with what could be a repetitive game from becoming too stale. Certain monsters and bosses seemed hard at first, but could be easily demolished with the right combination of offensive and defensive magic. Some bosses would encourage you to only use a few types of magic, and in my playthrough, that challenge gave me a good amount of fun throughout. I died a good few times fighting a few bosses, but after my first death, I had a good understanding of what strategy I could use to deal with them next time around. With the remakes, you also get the ability to speed up time, remove random encounters, and get full health and instant access to your limit breaks. I used these a lot during my playthrough, and do think if I played the original on the PS1, without these I wouldn't have completed it. While I didn't use the God mode on boss fights, the ability to explore areas at 3 times the speed and free of random encounters was great. I mean, some of the best items you can find in the game are hidden around, so exploration is really encouraged. Plus, sometimes I did just want to find that hidden item, or push through a slightly confusing area without stopping for a fight every 20 seconds. Considering all the issues I had with generally getting from A to B with it not being very clear, the ability to do this made the exploration a lot easier to put up with. Also, a lot of areas don't have a lot of enemies, so after 4 or 5 fights, you've most likely seen all the enemies that area has to offer. I feel like the game's story is the best part of the game by far, so although the boss fights are very interesting, seeing the same enemy for the 5th time in 2 minutes got pretty old pretty fast. Full credit to those game designers for the enemy designs though. They're some of the wackiest I've ever seen in a game. You fight robots, soldiers, seahorses, a motorbike, a house, a lava squirrel, and that's just scratching the surface. With these abilities, it was a bonus that it let me decide on when I wanted to go out and do some grinding. I remember at one point I just went off to this island in the middle of the ocean and grinded for a few hours while watching some videos on YouTube. With the ability to turn God mode on and off at a push of a button, you don't ever really need to do this, but I wanted to upgrade some of my magic and improve my stats. So it was nice to just decide that I want to go out to do this and the game let me do it. Throughout the adventure, it also had loads of mini-games integrated into it. From a squatting mini-game at a gym, a snowboarding mini-game, a full strategy game defending a hut, and even a slot mini-game on Tifa's Limit Break. If I'm honest, they felt a little out of place and I wasn't too fond of them. I can see the idea behind it. At the time the game released, there were a lot of players that were looking for a fast-paced action game, and I think they implemented these just to add a little something to the game and make it feel a little bit more fast-paced and a bit more varied compared to the more traditional RPGs. And even if I don't like them, I suppose it was a good way to break up the game. Some of these were necessary to progress, but most of them were optional, so I was happy to pass these up where possible. Regarding controls, they were fine, but I did feel like occasionally I would get a second or two of lag while in menus in battle. It was never consistent enough to be an issue, but it did make me choose the wrong option in battle or go back into another menu by mistake a good few times. It wasn't game breaking or anything, but it did make me take an extra second whenever I was in a boss battle just to make sure I picked the right option before confirming it. Well, considering how much I loved playing Final Fantasy VIII as a kid, I think I would have absolutely adored Final Fantasy VII if I'd played it at the time. Some aspects of the game haven't aged too well, like how frequent random encounters are, the importance it puts on grinding to gain that better magic, and well, the graphics, they can just be a little offensive to look at. But the ability to either stop or speed up random encounters, and the ability to use God mode to either cruise through the game, or at least use it to make grinding something you can pick up and choose when you want to do it, helped to make it a great overall game, that I would recommend to anyone who's a fan of classic RPGs. One thing I might suggest to help your enjoyment of the game is a walkthrough. I'd never played the game before and I spent a lot of time in the game just walking around endlessly, trying to find out what I had to do or where I needed to go next. I think I would have enjoyed the game more with a brief description of what I needed to do or where I needed to go at times. You'll have to come to accept the graphics are lacking and there are a few clunky menus to work through, but all in all, it didn't take away from the amazing story and the rich soundtrack that I'm now glad I played through.